Okay, am I okay here? We're good? Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming on this happy Friday afternoon on a really calm week in the legislature. I know it's been super chill. So thank you all for being here. My name's Sam Gordon. I'm the Chief Program Officer at Tech Equity. We're here today with fabulous panelists and moderator, which we're really thankful to them for, to talk about AI and competition. So this is a topic that I think when I was like reaching out to folks about this, they were like, I think a lot of folks are kind of like, do I need to think about this piece, this whole crazy piece? So really excited you guys are here because I think it's a really interesting piece of the puzzle. This is the second in sort of a series of events we're putting on for legislative staff as well as partners and members of the community. So there's folks here in the room, but there's also folks on Zoom. And we're recording these events so that we can have them. Our goal is really just to make sure that you all here in the legislature and our partners feel equipped to talk about some of these issues on a deeper level. I think AI has been obviously a very big topic of conversation. I think at my last count, we were at 50 bills related to AI this session. And so really just wanting to make sure you all know advocates, experts, people working on these issues that are here in California that you have access to and getting an opportunity to learn from them. So before I hand over to our panel and our moderator, I'm just going to click through tech equity. These are some of the things we do. We address economic equity issues at and the intersection of technology and the tech industry's business practices. And we have a couple housekeeping things for this event. One is we enforce a code of conduct at our events. And so that just basically says like, be respectful of other people's ideas. I think you all know that well. And then for questions, you'll see there's little question cards at your table. If you have a question, you can write it down. Just raise your hand. One of our team members will grab it from you. And then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. And we're a pretty small group too. So if you have questions, you want to stand up and just ask them when we get to that point, that's great as well. And like I said, the event, there's Zoom, it's being live streamed and it's also being recorded. So as an FYI. And my last thing I'll say is at Tech Equity, in addition to doing these events, we've released policy principles to help guide you all in thinking about how to evaluate the different bills that are coming. And those policy principles at a high level say three things. One is that the folks that are most impacted by AI need to have agency to shape how that technology impacts them. Second is that we have a responsibility to shift the burden of proof from individuals who don't have access to information, don't know these systems are being used upon them, to the companies and regulators who can actually learn about these systems and what's happening. At the same time, we should empower private citizens with that information to take action and pursue their rights. And finally, which today we'll really talk about, is that we don't think you can truly and effectively ensure that technology is safe and beneficial to everyone if you don't deal with the concentration of power in the industry. There is a concentration of power both from the companies, but also in terms of information and data that makes it very, very difficult to effectively regulate. So today we're going to talk about AI and competition. And with that, I will hand it to Kari Johnson to get us started and have the panelists introduce themselves, and we'll go from there. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, everyone, and thanks for showing up. My name's Kari Johnson. I'm a tech reporter for Cal Matters. I've been on that job since like January, so still working on that. But we've gotten an excellent panel here to have a conversation about competition and power and how this all intersects with AI. But, you know, just to get started, if you could, you know, tell us a bit about yourself and introduce yourself and talk about how your work intersects with AI.
Sure. Great. Thank you, Kari. Terry Oli, I'm the Director of Economic Security California. We are an issues advocacy organization, and we're the affiliate of an organization called Economic Security Project. And we operate in the space of advocating for ideas that will build an economy where people have the freedom and stability to thrive. And we work on two primary fights. One is around cash policy, putting money into the pockets of people who need it most. And that looks like guaranteed income. It looks like expanding refundable tax credits, ensuring access and equity in those programs. But we kind of quickly came to realize that, you know, working to put money into people's pockets is only half the the loaf if we're not dealing with the other side, which is the forces that are actually pulling money out of people's pockets. So looking at what are the things, what are the pieces that are driving the affordability crisis that relate to dysfunctional markets, to markets that are not competitive, that are distorted, and where corporate concentration and then corporate power actually plays an outsized role. And so that's how we started to work on both anti-monopoly issues as well as ways in which the government can play two roles, one in sort of regulating monopolies and trying to curb that amassing of corporate power, but also the role that government plays in actually being an actor in some of these distorted and dysfunctional markets. We can get into more of that later, but really nice to be here. Thank you.
Just recently started in your position, right?
I've actually been with the organization since 2018, but we just established the California affiliate a couple months ago. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. And my name is Lee Hepner. I'm Senior Legal Counsel at American Economic Liberties Project, AELP, Economic Liberties, bit of a mouthful. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, largely based in Washington, D.C. We have little outposts across the country, but we focus on market structure issues. We focus on antitrust. We focus on concentrations of power in the economy. We are kind of operating under the assumption that, or based on data that over 70% of industries in this country have become increasingly concentrated over the past quarter century, past 20 years or so, and that has had a dramatic effect on the way that wealth is distributed, the way that work looks these days, the way that companies innovate. Our work is really spread across industries. We have portfolios around the airline industry and concentration issues there, healthcare industry, agriculture and food access, and of course, tech is a big part of our work, given that some of the largest companies in the world are based in the United States. 3 of the largest companies in the world are based in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I live, and that concentration of power has effects on how products are delivered, how innovation occurs, whether they are innovating to meet the preferences of consumers and honoring the needs of workers who are creating content that ultimately needs to be distributed to consumers, or whether they are, in fact, quote unquote, innovating to preserve their market share, to build walled gardens around their product ecosystems, and actually prevent new, cool, exciting things from happening. And that's kind of an entry point into how we think about artificial intelligence, which I'm eager to talk about today.
Nice, thank you. And when I think about antitrust and actions against companies, I tend to think of the Federal Trade Commission and Congress, but what are some of the places where that's happening here in California, where you can see the efforts to battle concentration of power?
I'm so excited to answer that question. I think, and I know Lee has definitely some things to add to this as well. But first of all, as Lee was just saying, as the state where some of the largest tech companies live and operate and were founded, and where the majority of the tech industry actually grew up over the last several decades, we are we have kind of an outsized role in addressing the concentration that we see in the tech industry, in other industries too, but definitely in the tech industry. I think for a couple of reasons. Number one, 1 in 8 Americans lives in the state of California, and so any of these companies that's operating in the United States is, and operating in California is actually intersecting with, 1 in 8 Americans. So that's first of all, just population. Second of all, we have a deep bench in terms of expertise. We have people, you can't walk down the street without, you just reach out your hands walking down the sidewalk in San Francisco, and you're going to run into people who have expertise in how the industry works, how the industry doesn't work. And I think that gives us an opportunity and an obligation actually to think about the kind of regulation and other types of policy that we would want to enact in California. I think those are really important pieces to consider. That, and then the third thing is that we have a government that is willing to do things, right? We have a legislature that will be bold, will lead, and seize the responsibility of leading here, which I think is not true in some other places. And I know people would like to look to Congress and think, oh, we should be doing more things there. But that is not happening in the way that we would want. And so I think California plays that role. And then the fourth thing, I know Leo will definitely touch on this, is also we have, including in that leadership is also a bold Attorney General's office that has been jumping in a lot of important fights and even launching some. So I'll pass it to Lita. Keep going with that one.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one thing that's important to recognize is that there's a lot of AI regulation going on. It happens in many different ways. It may not look like artificial intelligence regulation. I think there's some level setting to do. Maybe we can circle back to this about what artificial intelligence even is, and how we kind of approach it definitionally and how that informs, how we address and regulate it. But a lot of stuff is going on. You see a lot of enforcement efforts going on, and yes, Attorney General Rob Bonta has been a big champion, partnering with federal agencies like the Federal Trade Commission and the Justice Department on really just sweeping landmark cases against some of the big tech giants, Google, kind of chief among them, which is firing right now. There's last fall, there was a 10-week trial against Google over its dominance and monopoly power over the search market. Their search engine powers well over 90% of internet searches, and part of that is due to the way that Google has seized control over distribution channels for their search engine while depriving entry paths for others. AG Bonta has partnered in that lawsuit. That is about AI. That lawsuit is fundamentally about artificial intelligence. I mean, it is about the future of innovation and how we are breaking down some of those exclusive tie-ups, particularly, the fact that Google pays, upwards of $26 to $40 billion per year to Apple to monopolize the distribution channel on, on Apple smartphones, which are now, facing a lawsuit for being a monopoly itself. So the way that all of these kind of distribution channels are tied up, and the potential to sort of break up some of those relationships and those exclusive dealing relationships really is about the future of innovation. At the app level of artificial intelligence, search is an app that is increasingly being powered by AI, or machine learning, or those foundational models. And I think that that's an area where we should absolutely be expecting to see a lot of innovation, a lot of consumer focused, consumer benefiting innovation that also respects, by the way, content providers who, create the data that fuels some of those models. So that's where we want to see innovation. That's where existing enforcement opportunities hold the potential to kind of create those avenues for market entry, and prevent them from being gobbled up by the Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta kind of chokehold on innovation right now. We could get into a whole conversation about the tens of bills that are pending right now in the state legislature, touching on different forms of artificial intelligence, software algorithms that create competition issues, and we can go there. Before I pass it off back to you, the other thing is that labor is doing a lot of this too. Labor is regulating AI. When the WGA won as a term of their settlement of the strike, they had a condition that there would be minimum staffing in the writer room, specifically to stave off the potential that AI was going to take over the writer room. That is AI regulation. That is labor organizing and doing actual industrial policy to stem the negative consequences of AI usurping labor power. Teamsters put forward a bill, I'm sure some folks are aware of, requiring a human driver in automated trucks. That is labor organizing to do industrial policy and regulate AI. And so I think labor has a huge part to play in this.
Lee, you mentioned, some of the antitrust cases and the case against Google last fall. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but are there existing forms of enforcement that are being used to, to regulate monopoly power? What are some of the existing forms of enforcement?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a robust body of antitrust law and jurisprudence dating back to the 1890s. It's a fascinating history, the way that these laws have developed and fluctuated and been narrowed over time. Since the 1870s, the Sherman Act,
Right,
which
yeah.
which prevents restraints of trade or illegal monopolization by single firms. Has been winnowed and narrowed through a very deliberate economic project to focus on efficiencies and to put efficiency above all else, but really ignoring the important conversation related to antitrust, which is about power, power in our society, and how corporate power, as a separate topic from efficiency gains, corporate power was at the core of the antitrust laws, and they were passed in the 1890s, in 1914 again. So there's been a resurgent effort in the past several years, which some of you, hopefully a lot of you have picked up on, the really kind of revolutionary energy at the Federal Trade Commission at the Justice Department to reinvigorate these laws and enforce these laws through a lens that also tries to invoke some of those power dynamics.
Yeah, and I know that there were a few bills in Congress that were trying to get at this. I don't think any of those ever made it anywhere, but the work that the committee did on the antitrust committee in Congress did in the report that they compiled gets into a lot about artificial intelligence and why it was necessary to change existing law for antitrust for some of the big tech companies. So I've covered specifically artificial intelligence since 2016, and something that I found in conversations with people who are in this space is that it can be quite personal, their journey to appreciating just how concentrated that power is. How and when did it become clear to you that antitrust and corporate consolidation are important parts of the conversation about AI?
Yes, I think that is it's a good question. I like the way you framed it around personal, because it does feel like in this conversation, people are intersecting with AI individually, perhaps, and maybe in their work and all these kind of different ways. And I think sometimes there's this idea that, especially with tech, that like, oh, because we might be using it or think that it's like cool and whiz bang in some way, that like then somehow we're like we shouldn't also at the same time be thinking deeply and structurally about what the role of AI is in society and what we should be doing with it or to it. I think that the way I like to think about AI, and I'm glad we're kind of coming back to that, because I think we should level set around this, is that it is, as much as it feels like this new burgeoning part of the economy, it is really just a new chapter, another chapter in an existing book around technology and big tech, which frankly, related to concentration, is a book that sits with many other books on a bookshelf of corporate concentration, of industries that have become increasingly consolidated and concentrated over the last number of years. Tech has been is very concentrated. And when you look at AI, it is really striking. So for people thinking about, the AI stack, right, it starts with the chips, the hardware, and then the compute power. And at that space, the compute power and the models. So those are like the kind of bones of the AI architecture. There are really a handful of companies that own that space. And that means it's just absolutely consequential for what comes into being in terms of those whiz bang apps that we might think are kind of cool. Like when there are only, a handful of companies that really own the vast majority of the computing power, and then therefore, those models are costing hundreds of millions of dollars to train, using the computing power. That means that the things that come into being are the things that pass muster and are appealing to those very few companies. And that just really like flattens the whole idea of of this ecosystem, right? We think of it as this like burgeoning sector, and there's all this cool stuff that's starting and happening, but really it's only if it has sort of the blessing and is appealing to those companies and those important choke points.
It's very evident in the generative AI conversations that that's what's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it means that that is consequential for what comes into being, like what comes into the market. It's also consequential for, frankly, for our, our democracy. And that's the intersection for us, is really thinking about that space, the political economy. And for me, it's ultimately about who decides. And when there are 4 companies that own effectively all of that space and all of that computing power, the answer is they decide. And is that the world we want to live in? Or do we want to live in a world where actually that is a more wide open space and there are things that are getting developed and brought into being that are, that are in line with and dedicated to the public good? And that's the real fundamental question that I think we're talking about here.
I mean, I think Terry hit it on the head. I mean, just so people know, I mean, the company that creates the machines that build chips that power AI, there's a single company that makes that machine. It's a Dutch company, and it sells that machine for $200 million per machine. I mean, there's one company at the top of this. They build the chips, or then you have the chip manufacturers who buy the machines, and there's maybe 1-2 companies that do it. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC, is the big company that makes chips for NVIDIA and ARM. And that's kind of it at that level. Then you have the cloud computing, which kind of uses those chips. And at the cloud computing level, there's really only 3 players. There's Amazon, there's Amazon, Microsoft, and Google and Alphabet. Yeah. So there's only 3 companies at the cloud computing level who really have what it takes to enter into that extremely high level of entry kind of market space. Below that, you have the foundational models, and that's where you have things like OpenAI and ChatGPT, and you see increasingly that the companies who control the cloud are starting to own the layer of the foundational models. So you see it becomes a little bit less concentrated, but you can see in the vertical how deeply concentrated AI already is and how that affects the app level, which is, what we tend to use, the customer service apps, the search engines, where you want to see the most innovation, but it's also being controlled at those vertical levels. So I think you kind of nailed that. I mean, and the other reality that you touched on too is what I was going to start with, which is that artificial intelligence is really neither artificial nor intelligent. I mean, I think people who actually do the technology will call it, something more like machine learning, like scientists will call it more like machine learning. And the term artificial intelligence has been around for 60 years. And, you had Alan Turing talking about machine intelligence and, theorizing that the human brain was kind of like a powerful computer. But this has been, kind of a marketing term that's kind of come and gone in vogue for 60 years. It's a human creation, and it reflects the political and social and cultural context in which it is created. My personal experience with this 5-6 years ago, I was working on a bill to ban facial recognition software, the use of facial recognition software by law enforcement in San Francisco. We successfully passed that, but it was in that conversation where we engaged with and were motivated to pursue this because this was not an unbiased technology. It disproportionately failed to recognize faces of darker complexions. And that was because it was trained, using faces of white people. And it was actually, these are not neutral, unbiased systems. They reflect the context in which they're created and who creates them. And so I think approaching it through that lens and understanding that AI is an overlay too of culture, of corporate concentration, really is a healthy way to think about how to approach it from a regulatory standpoint.
To add one more thing to that, which is the other thing I think is really important to think about from a framing perspective is that the technology industry has largely come up, born and raised in the last 40 odd years, during which time we as a country were really, we let our antitrust muscles really atrophy during that time. So that is a really interesting kind of dynamic that unlike many other industries that are regulated in some way and have seen some kind of, would expect to be regulated, right? Like either a utility or, maybe it's the Air Resources Board, or maybe it's the Federal Aviation Association, whatever it is, like there's an expectation of regulation. Technology in general, big tech and its kind of prevalence in our lives has really kind of come into being in a time when we just weren't really regulating much. And so they're kind of used to not being regulated. And so in some ways, like the ability to go far and fast and amass all that power and that concentration at a corporate level has coincided with a time when we just have been we've been enamored of a notion of free market, unfettered markets. And so that's another piece of the dynamic. And that I think also really plays into why we're a little on our back feet right now in terms of thinking about this from a regulatory perspective.
Yeah, essentially, with the exception of cases that have come within the last few years, before that, it was just Microsoft.
Yep.
And then nothing. This is a bit off of, what we were going to talk about, but do you feel like part of the conversation that tends to go with technology and tech policy is for several years, it seemed to be argued by a fair deal of companies that we can regulate ourselves. We got this. Do you feel like we're still there, or are we just far past in like public perception? Do people still believe that that's possible, that companies can regulate themselves in tech? AI?
I mean, the polling suggests that the American public, something like 63% of Americans, in this poll in the last few months, believe that AI should be a priority for regulation.
Mhm.
Someone jokingly quipped that the other 37% live in the Bay Area, which may very well be true. But I think there is, during this 40 years in the wilderness of not having real, of sort of neoliberalism, unfettered markets, whatever, what have you. I think we have seen concentration and amassed corporate power, and at the same time, just the disparities and just exacerbated disparity in terms of the economic experience of everyone else. We are on track to mint a trillionaire in the not too distant future. I mean, that is astonishing to even get your head around. Meanwhile, millions of households in California live with incomes under $30,000 a year. So to put those two things kind of in the same space is just really, I think, evidence of how concentration has driven our economic divide, and a lot of the issues that we continue to face in terms of creating an economy where people have what they need and can be fully engaged as citizens, fully engaged as people, have agency in their lives, and lead the good life, right? Which is, I think, is what we all want at bottom. So I think that is a really important piece.
Yeah.
And I'll just add, regulation is good for industry. I mean, a modicum of it. I mean, the antitrust laws are not anti-business, and I think the understanding or the belief that they are anti-business is, a weapon that's kind of deployed by monopolists or the people who actually control, a lot of market power in these industries. So, an example in the AI industry. I mean, last year the Federal Trade Commission, intervened in a potential merger between NVIDIA and ARM, another chips manufacturer, and blocked that merger. And there was a real kind of catastrophic sort of, this is, a terrible thing. There's always this kind of adverse reaction to the potential of blocking a merger, or there's a necessity to the merger. There's an inevitability to the merger that is, kind of talked about as a way to stave off intervention. FTC blocked that merger, and NVIDIA turned into $1 trillion company, and ARM is soaring. So I think that to flip the question, it's just that, regulation and antitrust are pro-business. I mean, these are pro-business things. They're pro-consumer, they're pro-labor, they're pro-business, they're pro-innovation. And I think we see examples of that. The other example that, the recent case against Apple, which if you want to read a fun complaint, read the Justice Department's, I'm sorry, maybe this is, exposing myself, but read the complaint against Apple. It is narrative. It tells a story. It tells many stories. It is a really readable and beautiful document. And one of the anecdotes that they elevate in that document is that Apple, an Apple executive at one point said that they thought that they were delivering products that were good enough, quote unquote, good enough, that was their threshold for rolling out new products. And when's the last time you've been excited about a new iPhone update? It's been a minute. And I think part of it is that the innovation and the good, that comes from competition, that impulse has atrophied as we've let these companies amass so much power that they only feel the need to deliver products that are quote unquote good enough. So I think, regulation and enforcement are good for business generally.
Yeah, I know a lot of regulators who use the brakes analogy, that putting brakes on the car helps you go faster. You got a question?
Speaking of that, speaking of like video farm culture and the ideas stuff, a little bit more. How do we insulate ourselves moving forward? Because the next and you think about how much the internet has changed even in the last year. How do we insulate ourselves so that in 4 years we're not in a really terrible situation?
Well, I have some ideas. Yeah, because I think, given that the audience here is primarily around legislative staffers and, other partner organizations, I think the question is like, what can we do here and now and in California in particular? So one huge opportunity, of course, is that we can pass legislation here in California. So we can do things. And since we are the place where, again, 1 in 8 Americans lives, if you want to do business in California, you've got to abide by the laws here. That's good and a power that we should absolutely flex. Sort of specifically, I think we, and to Lee's point, there is this sort of reflexive fear around like, oh, we're going to regulate something business, and then the opposition is often, it will say things like, well, you don't know if you're going to get it right, and it might have unintended consequences, and you're going, who knows, if you touch the bubble, it might burst, and who knows what will happen. And I think we need to kind of get over that a little bit and realize that like the economy, the economy is not the weather. We can shape it, we can create it, we can affect it. Like we do have some power, and I think we often kind of are afraid that we're, that it's like a little scared beast that we're gonna, scare off. And I think we have to kind of get over that. So that's important. I think specifically there are a couple of specific opportunities. Number one, speaking of kind of finding our antitrust muscles, the 100-year-old California antitrust statute, the Cartwright Act that was passed, like 100+ years ago, is actually undergoing a review and revision process right now. So there's a set of public meetings, one in May, one in June, and one in September, that will be looking at a series of 7 really detailed reports that look at aspects of our modern economy and ways in which the existing, again, 100-year-old statute does or does not address the corporate concentration issues that are, kind of happening in our modern economy, specifically around tech, but around other things as well. And so that process is an opportunity for all of us to weigh in on what our economy looks like now. I think it's worth noting in 1966, the Supreme Court of the United States blocked a merger in Los Angeles between 2 grocery stores, because it would allow that merged entity to have like 7.5% of the grocery market. 7.5%. Like that in the modern world, right? It's just, you can't even get, that's just crazy, right? So I think we are like way past where we were, like we have let the horses out of the barn for a really long time. And so we have an opportunity now to kind of revisit that. So I think that's important. And then of course we do have AI legislation we can talk about too, but I'll let Lee talk or Kari ask a question.
I think you covered that. I mean, we talk about the durability of change and how to kind of, make sure that this exciting moment for people who've been following along over the past 3 years or so, stays and has legs. There was a panel at the Stiegler Center yesterday about, the end of the beginning of the new antitrust era. And I think that there is kind of an understanding that we're at an inflection point, and that on some level we may have won the ideological argument, and now it's about implementing that. An organization like ours, we focus a lot on governance. I mean, we put pressure on people who are in public office to do their jobs and to use the authority and the power that they have. And I think that that's, you know, a really big part of it too is continuing to put pressure on the people who are in positions of power to push those levers and to do that work. That, you know, prevents the atrophying that Terry was talking about. And then of course, the state work will always continue. The CLE, the California Law Revision Commission project. If you guys are remotely interested in this, you should all tune into that. They just released 7 working group reports that are fascinating, that are disagreeable in some ways, that are great in other ways, that we're picking apart and responding to, that you should take a look at. I mean, it's a fascinating recital of the history of California antitrust law, and that'll be an ongoing study for the next year or so.
Nice. Any other questions from the audience? I'll bring the mic to you. You can come to me to, oh, we got all, that's the questions? Dang. Let's see here. This one comes from Sam. Can you talk about some of the mechanisms we could use for this? Examples, interoperability, monopoly enforcement, etc.
Firm conduct,
Yes.
monopsony enforcement.
Exactly. Oh my goodness. Well, how many hours do we have? So one of the things that Lee was spelling out was like the different layers in the AI stack in particular. Yeah, because I feel like we've kind of ventured into like anti-monopoly more broadly, but kind of coming back to AI and technology. So Lee was talking about the different layers in the stack. So it's not, again, it's not unheard of in other industries to disallow ownership in that vertical. It is true in banking. You can't run, you know, a broker deal. You can't be a broker dealer in an investment bank without like a wall between. You can't, like there are limits on what you can do. And we have over the history of our country, you know, passed laws and had regulations that prevent that kind of like vertical ownership. In fact, you know, the origin of some of our early antitrust working in the country, in the United States, was this kind of interesting to think about. The railroads were, you know, the only game in town, right? In the early 1900s, like that was transportation. And a lot of what they were transporting was actually coal and timber. And you know, because that's how we heated our homes and did everything. And they started to think, you know, what would be really cool is if we owned the land that the coal's being mined and the timber is being felled, because then we could just carry our own product, and wouldn't that be cool? And Congress jumped into action and said, no, that's not okay. If you're a common carrier, if you're providing this kind of infrastructure service commercially, then you can't also be you know, you can't also own the product. And that's like a super normal thing to do in many industries. We do not have that in tech. And what Lee was talking about is that ownership down the stack, and all the headlines you read, like when you read them about like this group going over to that company and this company being bought by that company, that is just like more and more and more kind of consolidation and sort of moving of the deck chairs, if you will, but really within those same kind of like really strictly owned sort of ownership verticals. So I think that is something that, you know, is an opportunity that we can think about, which is to structurally separate the, you know, if you are holding out computing power commercially, then perhaps you can't also own models. If you're running a model and deploying a model, then perhaps you also can't run applications. And we're seeing some of that in Europe, you know, so the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, et cetera. We're seeing some of that where they're saying like, okay, if you own a platform, you can't favor some of the players on that platform. And so there's these things about, yeah, not allowing self-preferencing, about splitting up the layers, structural separation is what that's called. And so there are many models in other industries. And it's only because, as I was kind of saying, at least my opinion, is only because the tech has come up in this 40 years of unfettered market mythology that we have not done more of that to date. But that does not mean that we can't. And I would argue that we should.
Right. So like the idea being that if you have a foundational model, you know, maybe you should be subject to a non-discrimination or a non-self-preferencing sort of regulation that says that you can't turn away people who want to use your foundational model. It doesn't mean you have to give your foundational model away, for free. That's not at all it, but it's about not being able to discriminate between who is able to innovate using that. And that's a concept that has, a rich history in American law. The other industry that I love to talk about that did this in the 1940s was the movie industry, Hollywood. I mean, there was the Paramount decrees structurally separated movie production from movie theaters, because it turned out when the movie producers and movie creators owned the movie theaters, they were only showing their own movies. They were entering into these bundling deals that was, harming independent movie theaters that were not owned by the studios, and it was withholding content and movies from being aired at independent movie theaters and kind of crushing this whole kind of economy. And so, the Department of Justice stepped in then and structurally separated movie production from movie distribution. This is something that's resurging right now as we think about the streaming industry and how content is created and distributed via technology today. And so there's many ways to think about this and the need for this kind of relatively mundane kind of regulation that has become more recently. Just it seems to be boggle people's minds, even though it is kind of normal historically.
I'm just going to point out that actually one of the bills that we're co-sponsoring this year, SB 1047 with Senator Wiener, actually has a non-discrimination provision in there for fair and transparent and non-discriminatory pricing of large models and large computing clusters for that very reason. To say like, yeah, it's okay, you can hold these out commercially, but you need to, it has to be fair, transparent. We have to see what's going on, because otherwise you get that kind of preferencing that's opaque and invisible.
Any recommendations for books or resources to learn more about the state of policy for tech? I was going to say one on the antitrust side that I enjoyed was the Curse of Bigness by Tim Wu. Thin little book, read it in the afternoon, weekend, depending on how quick you read. But
I have a good one. Oh, yeah. Well, I was gonna give a shout out to actually the Vanderbilt University, the Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator. There is a lot of work happening there, and they have a whole section of work on AI and anti-monopoly in particular.
Mhm.
And there's both a brief that is actually quite brief, and then a long paper that is the longer version.
Yes.
But those are really great resources and go into detail about structural separation, about kind of the history of antitrust, but then also how that applies in a modern tech environment and AI. And yeah, it's just Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator. It's a really good resource.
I love footnoting my comments, and I was going to mention the Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator document as well. There's a book by Kate Crawford called Atlas of AI that is fascinating and really designed to make you think differently about artificial intelligence. A lot of my thinking is informed by that book. Another Curse of Bigness was foundational for me, and that was just like a wonderful, great book by Tim Wu, who has written other books. He's written one called The Attention Merchants. It's really good. There's the self-described mascot of the organization that I work at, Matthew Stoller, has written a book called Goliath, which is another kind of heterodox, really lucid history of antitrust law in America and the way it got so bungled in the 60s and 70s, how we got to where we are today. I can't recommend that one highly enough.
there we are. Yeah, and then I was going to say that antitrust report that the report that the antitrust committee put together, that was chaired by Representative Cicilline, I believe. It's lengthy, but it gets into the startups consolidation and the activities of different companies. That is a good sort of foundational understanding of how we got to right here.
That one's like 400 pages long, but,
Right,
but you can skip to the section on Amazon and
There you
learn
go.
all about Amazon. It's really good. That was a great report. That's a subcommittee report of the House Judiciary on competition in digital markets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There seems to, this is another question. There seems to be a bigger issue at play, the removal of human contact. We see this in healthcare. Please talk about the societal impact on health, especially with the evolution of new viruses and diseases.
I mean, this is like my thing. Like AI has to be something more than just replacing jobs. It's not it turns out it's not even cost effective in some ways. I mean, when there was the recent snafu, I think where Whole Foods pulled out their automated checkout lanes because it turns out they were actually human powered by low wage labor. What is that?
The Amazon Go.
Was that, it was the Amazon Go stores? Yeah, the just walkout thing. So sometimes it's not even real that you're replacing labor. You're just diminishing labor. You're just making labor worse. There's, back to this notion that AI is kind of a marketing term. RealPage is a piece of software that there's been a lot of attention about its ability to fix rents in an already kind of crisis level situation with housing. If you want to learn more about RealPage, it is there was a great ProPublica report. We've put out a report on rent or price fixing in the rental housing market. But it turns, I mean, there's a theory there that what they're calling this, artificial intelligence or this software algorithm is actually just a fancy Excel spreadsheet that is, manipulated by human beings. So, it's not necessarily that we're replacing jobs. It's that we're changing the nature of work and making the work poorer and worse. And I think in the healthcare industry, man, I mean, as healthcare consolidation, takes place, we've just seen working conditions for nurses, in particular at UPMC in Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania more broadly, is just the testimony from nurses there and the testimony from nurses at the California Nurses Association in California. I mean, it's fundamentally about how do you increase patient care, and is removing the human contact and the kind of customer service aspect of the job the best way to deliver that? I mean, I arguably not. I think it's a good argument that it's not.
Yeah. I always think of the delivery robots, food delivery robots. Well, no, they're like driven by like people who are driving them in like Colombia or something. Well, I can't remember. I think it's Starship is the particular company, but oh man, I don't know. How can legislative staff learn more about law revision commission work on Antitrust Act?
Oh, let me give you my email. No, really, seriously, if you're interested, this is a big deal because the process during this, next few months will govern, well, I think will drive what ends up getting kind of bundled together into a sort of an omnibus legislative proposal in the fall for 2025, or maybe a collection of bills. But it is actually really important, and so I've reached out. I know our emails are available probably on the what was sent out from Tech Equity, and so please reach out to me. We are actually actively organizing and would absolutely love to talk to any legislators or legislative staff or other organizations that want to get involved in really combing through these reports and thinking about what's being proposed and what might need to be added and how we can make sure that we have a really good product on the other end of this process.
How do we make sure that more voices are reflected in conversations and innovation in AI?
Good question. I think that, in some ways, the fact that there are so many bills being considered in the legislature this year is indicative of how prevalent how many voices are actually already interested, because legislators take up bills that their constituents are coming to them with, or that they think are important to their constituents. So I think that is an indication of actually how much interest there is. And I think that in general, organizations like ours and like others are doing an excellent job of organizing to get voice to be heard in these conversations and in these debates. And obviously the process can always be more open, but I think that having the kinds of decision making that happens in a public forum, like a legislative process, is good. That's certainly better than things happening under the cover of darkness, or when this stuff isn't being debated and it's basically we're just kind of letting corporate control continue sort of unabated and unchecked. So I would say it's always about getting involved in the organizations that are putting have a stake in the game and that are getting involved in the legislative process.
And antitrust is just one tool. there are a lot of tools for addressing, concentrations of corporate power and accordant harms. There's labor law. There's, we even have, concepts of fairness that are really important and enforceable laws in California at the federal level. The table that we're working with and trying to set up is garnered a lot of interest from folks who I don't think about antitrust on a day-to-day basis, but see that there's an intersection with, oh yeah, I'm a consumer rights group. This is actually a tool that might come to bear for things that I've been thinking about. Labor groups are at this table as well. Racial and economic justice groups are at the table. Housing groups are at the table. It's a big tent. Antitrust is not going to solve every problem, but it sure does kind of focus a conversation in a way that I think a lot of people are finding productive right now.
Yeah. Empowering people to have control of their own data and engage in participatory design is an approach I think that some community organizations and companies have talked about. I don't know who's doing that well. I keep looking for them. If you hear from them, my email address is kari@calmatters.org. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Any burning questions? We've got time for maybe one or two more.
Thinking back to the NVIDIA CEO, and he had an interview that basically said that we started this 20 years ago, and knowing that there are sort of three or a half dozen organizations that sort of control the market. How do we encourage small businesses to do that? Like how do you, is there an opportunity for, a programmer in a garage anymore? Or is this something that's just going to be completely steamrolled by big tech?
I love that you bring up the mythology of the garage startup.
Made in California.
Yeah, that is, I mean, and it's like, there are people who really did that, right? I actually know someone who did that. And so I think that mythology is so ingrained in us that's the dream, right? California is, you have all this opportunity for innovation. And that is what is so painful about this conversation, or the reality of the concentration, is that that is really not possible right now in AI, because of the chokehold that the handful of corporations that run the really resource intensive pieces of the stack have on the whole ecosystem. And so I think there are a couple of answers. One, again, SB 1047 by Senator Scott Wiener, which I know you know something about, Brian. There is a piece of that bill that would actually create a publicly owned and operated cloud called Cal Compute. And so one of the things that we've learned, in this process of learning about AI and what the ecosystem looks like, is that because of that, the chokehold and the concentration, especially in compute and in foundational models, as I said before, what gets brought into market are only the things that are kind of liked and have the blessing of those few companies. We need to make that pie bigger, and we need to set up space so that there's actually, think of it like a library, right? Like a library versus a bookstore. We need to have there be spaces that are part of our public infrastructure where things can be created, and there can be innovation, there can be startup, and there can be research and cutting edge development that, again, is dedicated to and aligned with what the public wants, and not just what a few companies think will be monetizable for them. I think that's really important. And then I think just in general, thinking about how do we regulate tech and regulate AI, we should continue to march down that path and not let the fact that we haven't done it stop us from doing it going forward. And the metaphor that always comes to my mind is actually like, if you've ever spilled a bag of rice on the ground, like for years, you're finding little grains, right? Like under the rug or under the whatever. And I think we've learned this, I feel like we should have learned this lesson here, where we did not do anything about social media. And we said, we're worried we're going to get wrong. We don't know what, we should focus on the risks, not just not what might happen. And we can only, it's very tangible. We should only regulate what we can see instead of trying to be precautionary. And I think that that is a little bit like spilling that bag of rice, and that we are in a moment right now where we have an opportunity to be precautionary and to put in place some common sense regulations and restrictions on the operation of AI, whether that's addressing current harms, whether that's addressing future threats, and that we should absolutely be moving forward with that.
Just a couple, can I elevate a couple quick examples?
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask though about SB 1047. We talked about it before. I think it's a really interesting idea, but then it comes up against this tension of private companies spend millions and millions of dollars to train these generative models. So how can a public option compete?
Right, right. Well, I mean, we have examples of having invested in public infrastructure in our, in all around us. The Stem Cell Research Institute in California is a great example that we invested in public infrastructure because we said we wanted to be on the cutting edge of medical science and medical research, and that is a great example. Of course, our UC system, the Lawrence Livermore Lab, our national labs, Lawrence Livermore and Berkeley labs. We do have examples of public infrastructure, and yes, we are facing a budget deficit and all of that, but we need to be thinking about how we, as we ultimately, the state of California, and we as Californians need to engage in our own, in our own democracy, right? And if we let the fact that private companies have dominated this market continue to let that be the reason that they are allowed to continue to dominate this market, then we have really we have really given up. And we need to think about in the scope of our economy and the scope of our democracy, who decides? And at some point we have to create space for it to be us.
Yeah. Terry, you want to?
Yeah, I mean,
thoughts?
there are some really cool things going on, and the AI space does have a lot of really exciting potential. I think it's how do you cultivate that innovation, and that's the question, right? And the Federal Trade Commission just ran a competition to get people to create mechanisms for detecting voice mimicry, which is a cool way of investing in people who are trying to use AI productively. A good buddy of mine applied for a foundation grant and got a good chunk of money for what I think is a really incredible use of artificial intelligence to create large language models based on endangered languages, starting with the Navajo language. I think that's a really cool use of artificial intelligence that you might not think of outside the box of kind of foundation support and public support. The other thing, Meta.ai, I think launched maybe yesterday, or I heard about it first yesterday, probably through one of those self videos that Mr. Zuckerberg has been doing lately. But I jumped on Meta.ai and I was like, hey, does Meta have a monopoly in social media? And it's a very long considered response, not cited, probably, riffing off writing from people who deserve credit. But one of the bullet points that it returned was regulatory scrutiny. Meta faces intense regulatory scrutiny and antitrust investigations globally, which could lead to increased competition and innovation. I mean, that's from Meta's own AI, which is great. I mean, that's wonderful. I think part of the answer is there too, is part of kind of breaking up these concentrations of power to cultivate the innovation that you want to see from this exciting space.
And on that note, thank you to our panelists. Thanks for everyone for coming. And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all. That's really fun. Oh my God. It was like a deep dive. We went deep.
I don't know why I'm handing this.